opinions expressed on the KRISANNE Hall Show are not necessarily those of the host or station management, but are definitely those of the founders of this nation. Connecting the dots of the Constitution for you like no one else can. The KRISANNE Hall Show. She's an attorney, a disabled U.S. Army veteran, an author, public speaker, mother, pastor's wife, and a patriot. She's KRISANNE Hall.
Any informant that crosses that lady's path has met its match.
Rise and shine, liberty-loving patriots. I am coming live to you from Long Island, New York. KRISANNE Hall here behind the Liberty First microphone. Broadcasting over the internet and live through Freedom 93.3 Freedom FM. Hey, we're going to have a big day today. I had an amazing evening last night meeting with the Oath Keepers. I love meeting with the Oath Keepers. You know, I'm a former Army, Russian linguist, and if there's anything that I miss from being in the Army is that camaraderie, that brotherhood that you have in the military. And I love meeting with groups like the Oath Keepers because I get to feel that comfortable feeling again about being with people who are so dedicated to this country, so dedicated to liberty, and you would trust them with your life. I mean, there's nothing more comforting than being with someone, with a group of people who have that level of brotherhood. And it was just a really, really great night last night. We had a really great night, taught on the Second Amendment, the two questions that we need to ask all of our political employees, the two questions that all our political employees must be able to answer before we give them the opportunity to even discuss issues about guns. They want to have a common sense debate on gun legislation. I want to remind you, we are their employers. We are their employers, and it is incumbent upon us to ensure that they have the proper qualifications, the necessary skills to even discuss our guns. And I take a breath and pause and sigh because they don't have the right to discuss gun legislation from the get-go. So if they want to discuss this, they've actually just declared their fact that they're not qualified. But nonetheless, we should at least show them to themselves that we have this power. Show them that they're not qualified by asking two simple questions. What do the words "shall not be infringed" mean? And why do we have the Second Amendment? And these are the things that we taught last night at the Oath Keepers meeting. And it was a great, great meeting. We had a really great time. Let me mention, if you're interested in having that presentation for your group, don't hesitate to contact me at KRISANNEHall.com. KRISANNEHALL.com. Remember, I have no speaking fees. I don't require any reimbursement for traveler accommodations. We are a ministry, not a 501c3. We work by faith, though, not by government approval. And so I have that special lesson that I give on the Second Amendment. Now, we are going to talk about some stuff today, the real constitutionality of our current government's operation. A lot of stuff to talk about: taxing for welfare, seizing of property, taking of lives, First Amendment, freedom of speech and press, separation of powers. Lots of things going wrong today. And I want to mention to you that I posted on Facebook we were going to be talking about all these things, but further of reflection, I don't know that we'll get to them all, but I'm looking here this week at a series This week, we are going to be discussing every day the constitutionality and the lack of constitutionality of our current government's operations. These are the things we're going to be talking about: taxing for welfare, seizing of property, taking of lives, First Amendment freedom of speech and press, separation of powers, these types of things. I have been discussing ad nauseum Syria. I want to mention to you that I believe that I have given you all the possible evidence that you need, all the possible evidence and ammunition that your elected employee needs to defeat the government propaganda and its lies over Syria. I'm not going to continue to beat this to death. I have educated to the best of my ability. If you want that education, if you've missed that education, again, go to my website. I have listed out the facts on Syria, which, by the way, has been probably our most shared post so far on the Liberty Forum. I've also armed you with an open letter to send to your politician that demands that our politicians, ask the right questions. Now, I do want to mention something this morning that I found rather interesting. Okay, very, very interesting about this issue. My open letter on Syria that I have been arming you with has this very clause in it. It says, "The honest truth and unavoidable reality is this. You bear a great responsibility in this decision, perhaps one greater than you have considered. You must recognize that generations will be sharers of this one decision. You cannot make the wrong decision if you remain loyal to the foundations that made this nation great. Do not make this decision out of fear or preference for national security. Do not make the decision out of political avarice. Do not make this decision," and this is the part that I want you to understand, because this is very amazing. "Do not make this decision based upon less than complete evidence. You must make this decision with clarity of mind and with evidence beyond every doubt. To do otherwise," I said, "would be a negligent act perpetrated upon future generations." Can I mention to you that one of the headlines today says, White House: "Evidence against Assad, not beyond a reasonable doubt, but passes a common sense test." White House says it has no irrefutable evidence that Syrian President Bashar Assad was behind the August attack in Damascus, in a Damascus suburb, but that a strong common sense test, irrespective of intelligence, suggests the government is responsible. Now, I'm not so puffed up in my what am I trying to say this morning? I'm not so puffed up in myself to think that the president is responding to my letter, but is it possible that we are actually having an impact with this open letter to such a degree that the congressmen themselves are starting to chatter about this? And this is getting around. I mean, I'm just saying, for the very, very words of the very open letter that we have issued is now being reflected in the words of the White House. I'm just so pleased that we have so many liberty supporters out there that could even possibly be the case. That we are saying, do not make this decision based on less than complete evidence. You must make the decision with clarity of mind and with evidence beyond every doubt. And now the White House is responding to that very statement and saying the White House says it has no irrefutable evidence, but that we shouldn't be worried about beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond every doubt. We shouldn't be worrying about irrefutable evidence. We should work on strong common sense in spite of the intelligence. Are you catching this? I don't know. I'm just saying. The open letter's on my website. I'm going to be posting this article on Facebook later. You make the decision. You let me know if you think maybe we're actually having an impact. I'd like to think so. Now, before we get into today, let me put it this way. Before we get into this week's series on the unconstitutionality of our federal government, we're going to have a little lesson to establish the basics. Okay? We're going to have a lesson to establish the basics. Now, the first step to correcting a problem is understanding that we have one. And we are very aware that we have a problem. Our government, on the other hand, seems completely clueless. We have an executive branch issuing executive orders that are totally out of control and completely in violation of separation of powers. Congress is engaging in every mode of violating their own separation of powers. And specifically this morning, we're going to talk about the fact that Congress is engaging in every mode of spending that can be conceived. Sides of this political argument, arguing over how much to tax, and no one discussing this out of control spending. Now, our founders and even their immediate successors warned that this prospective government would subvert the very foundations and transmute the very nature of limited government established by the people of America. I want to mention to you, before we embark on this lesson, it's going to take great character and resolve to make the painful and difficult decisions to preserve this republic. And we have a responsibility to do that so future generations will have an opportunity to enjoy the liberty that has been purchased for us. But we have to look at the oracles of history and see the irrefutable, may I steal a word from the White House, the irrefutable lessons that they have for us. Liberty-loving patriots, it's time to perk up your ears. Take out your notepad and your pens. It's time to get educated. Our Oracle of History School is now in session.
The KRISANNE Hall Show. He's Liberty's lobbyist.
Just so you can tell your friends, family members, co-workers, we are starting a series this week on the unconstitutionality. We just call this the unconstitutionality of the operation of our federal government. We're going to be addressing many issues from many different sides, but in order to begin this lesson, or this understanding, we have to begin a lesson. We have to understand that, first off, our federal government is out of control. That should be something that we should not have any problem establishing. But what we have to know from the get-go is that this began to happen rather early on. The expansion of congressional power through what our framers called the forced construction of the constitutional charter is how this always happens. And the expansion of congressional power through forced construction of the General Welfare Clause is one of the chief culprits. Now, a great example of this, how we started going crazy pretty quickly, can be found in congressional arguments surrounding the Cod Fishery Bill of 1792. A bill to, well, let me put it this way. It was a bill to stop Great Britain from stealing our codfish off the coast. Now, what had happened was Great Britain was coming over to and fishing all of our codfish off of the coast of the continent in 1792. I'm sure they're still not happy about our independence at this time. And they're decimating our codfish population. And so the legislators got together to create a law to grant the U.S. authority to fight back on this issue, to prevent Great Britain from doing this. Inserted into this bill was some pork by some people to subsidize the cod fishing industry. In this argument against the subsidizing of the cod fishery industry, James Madison defines the proper nature of government to a House in 1792 wanting to unconstitutionally expand its power and reach. Now, Madison reminds us and says, I, sir, have always conceived. I believe those who propose the Constitution conceived, and still more fully known and more material to observe, that those who ratified the Constitution conceived. Who ratified the Constitution? Thomas Jefferson reminded us that it was an act of the whole American people. So Madison is saying, it's still more fully known and more material to observe that it was the whole American people that conceived. That this is not an indefinite government deriving its powers from the general terms prefixed to the specific powers, but a limited government tied down to the specific powers which explain and define the general terms. See, we are supposed to have a limited and defined federal government. Madison was very simply explaining that the clause, common defense and general welfare, it was not meant to expand the power of the government beyond its limitations, but was to describe the purpose of the power delegated within very, very strict confinement of those boundaries. This clause did not name power. The Common Defense and General Welfare Clause does not name a power. It simply describes the purpose for the powers named. Meaning, you're not allowed to do generally whatever you want to do. But what you do must be conducted in the light that everything you do is for the general welfare of the entire union. Meaning, you can't pass a law that benefits one state and bankrupts another. You can't engage in a treaty that benefits one state and detriments another. You can't go to war with a nation because of one state in opposition to another. Hey, we should be listening to this. The General Welfare Clause, Common Defense, does not name a power. It describes the purpose for that power. And then, with amazing foresight, Madison explains the consequences of allowing the federal government to turn these clauses into powers. Come back after the break and learn the limited government truth.
I'll be there beside you, baby, watching it all fade to blue.
The KRISANNE Hall Show. The KRISANNE Hall Show. She's Liberty's lobbyist.
The First Schoolhouse open today. KRISANNE Hall here behind the Liberty First microphone. Let your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers know we are going to engage on an educational series this week. The unconstitutionality of our current federal government and the warnings of our framers, the lessons that they have for us. As to review what we've done before the break, we have recognized, I think, overwhelmingly in this nation that we have a problem. Our founders gave us a warning that if we continued to allow our government to move in the manner that it's moving, that it would subvert the very foundations and transmute the very nature of limited government established by the people of America. Madison has, in the debate over the cod fishery bill of 1792, has remarked that we have a limited and defined government. It is not an indefinite government, but a limited government, tied down, he says. Tied down. He explains that the clause, the common defense and general welfare, was not meant to expand the power of the government beyond its limitations, but to describe the purpose of that power. And then, with amazing foresight, in this debate over the cod fishery bill of 1792, Madison explains the consequences of allowing the federal government to turn these clauses into defined powers. It's a principle called forced construction, where those who operate under the idea that the Constitution must be interpreted in certain ways that do not limit the government but actually expand the government. And Madison explains the consequences of allowing the federal government to turn the general welfare clause not into the purpose for the government, but into a power. And he says if Congress can employ money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they may take the care of religion into their own hands. They may appoint teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of their public treasury. And they may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing like-manner schools throughout the Union. May I mention Common Core curriculum? Madison says they may assume the provisions for the poor. They may undertake the regulation of all roads other than post roads. In short, Madison explains that if we allow Congress to turn the clauses of common defense and general welfare into an expansion of their power and not a mechanism to limit them, Madison says if Congress can employ money indefinitely to the general welfare, everything from the highest object of state legislation, he says, down to the most minute object of police, would be thrown under the power of Congress. For every object I have mentioned would admit of the application of money and might be called, if Congress so pleased, provisions for the general welfare. Madison, in describing the consequences of this forced construction, this forced escape from the boundaries established in a limited and defined constitution, actually becomes a prophecy for today. He says, Madison says in 1792, I venture to declare it is as my opinion that were the power of Congress to be established in the latitude contended for, this forced construction of power, this expansion of power through the employment of money, he says, I venture to declare it as my opinion that were the power of Congress to be established in the latitude contended for, it would subvert, overturn, undermine the very foundations and transmute the very nature of limited government established by the people. But guess what? We didn't even learn from that in 1792. Because in 1831 we have the same argument again. In 1831, Congress once again attempts to reconstruct its powers through the artifice now of charity. This time, in 1831, Congress wants to supply wood for the poor of Georgetown because of an unusually difficult winter. The mayor of Georgetown sent a letter to the House of Representatives in 1831 asking for relief of the poor of that city and soliciting the House to grant a donation of some wood in the vaults of the Capitol for their use. Now, we're not talking about money here. We're just talking about the federal government donating wood that they have stored up in the vaults in the Capitol for their use. This request sparked a very relevant debate for this day. Even though it's a forgotten one, a very relevant debate for this day. Now, this is not even the application of money, but this is the application of a resource that was purchased by the taxpayers. So it always goes back to money. Because you see, the federal government does not own anything without us. This is the perspective that we have lost. Even if it's wood stored in the vaults for capital use, they do not own that without it being our money first. Now, the first person to speak up in 1831 was Congressman James Polk, a Democrat in Tennessee. He's going to be the 11th president of the United States, but not yet. In a showing of a moral character and commitment to the Constitution that we rarely ever see today, Polk said, a Democrat said, he knew that it would be viewed as being ungracious to oppose a resolution in behalf of the suffering poor. However, he says, he went on to oppose the resolution of the House to offer this support as, and I quote, the precedent of appropriating the public funds for such a purpose was a bad one. He reasoned that if they allowed this seemingly small act of charity, then every winter when the snow fell or the Potomac was frozen, applications would be made to Congress and members would be engaged in the dignified object of buying and stowing wood to give to the poor District of Columbia. Polk opposed this spending on a very important principle that we have forgotten because we have failed to listen to James Madison's warnings about the expansion of power. Polk opposed giving wood to the poor as the House, he says, had not the power to make the donation requested. He said, and what would begin with Georgetown would blossom. Now listen to me. School is in session. I need you to understand this because we've got to get this out. Polk said in 1831, what began with Georgetown would blossom into dependency throughout the nation. It was not the amount he objected to, but that, and I quote, representatives came to legislate on the great concerns of the nation, not to give away public property. And he made his final plea to the House of Representatives that with their vote, they must put a check on legislative power, in order to prevent a dependency to spread throughout the nation. The next to argue was James Blair, congressman from South Carolina, and Blair gets right to the point. that it's not in the power of Congress to give out donations from the public treasury for the purposes of charity. Polk says this: if so, if we are allowed to give donations from the public treasury for the purposes of charity, he says, Congress would have the power also to vote millions of the public money to feed and clothe the suffering poor. The House had no right to give away public money for any such purpose, Blair says, and if gentlemen were to dispose to be liberal, let them be liberal out of their own money. And then Blair moved the floor for the following substitute. He was making an amendment to this proposition that the Congress provide wood for the people of Georgetown. And his amendment says that the sergeant at arms be required to deduct from the compensation of the members of this House on a day's pay and deliver said sum to the mayor of Georgetown to be applied to purchase fuel for the paupers of that town, provided, nevertheless, that such deduction shall be made from the compensation of such members only as a vote in favor of the resolution. He's saying, look, if the members of the House want to be charitable and help the poor, we don't have the authority to do this out of public money. So let's let members of the House deduct what they want to spend from their own pay and engage in the charity that they want to engage in. This brings up 3 lessons that we will learn from this. Come back after the break.
The KRISANNE Hall Show. The KRISANNE Hall Show. She's Liberty's lobbyist.
We are having school this morning, learning some essentials that we must understand if we are going to keep the proper perspective of government, if we are going to keep government in its proper boundaries. We are learning that the General Welfare Clause does not expand the power of the government, but actually limits and defines it. We are hearing from the framers that we have this problem with the government, with Congress expanding its power through forced construction. And then Madison says, I ventured to declare it as my opinion that were the power of Congress to be established in the latitude contended for, that they could subsidize industries, it would subvert the very foundations and transmute the very nature of the limited government established by the people. And then in 1831, we have a request from the mayor of Georgetown that the congressmen supply wood just this once out of the vaults held for the government's warmth for the winter. Our patriots back then, Congressman James Polk said that if we supply wood to the poor this one time, that it would be a precedent of appropriating the public funds, and it would be a bad one. He said every winter when the snow fell or the Potomac was frozen, applications would be made to Congress and members would be engaged in the dignified object of buying and stowing wood to give to the poor of the District of Columbia. He says Congress does not have the power to make the donations requested. He said the representatives came to legislate on great concerns of the great concerns of the nation and not to give away public property. Congressman James Blair of South Carolina argued that if the congressmen are so moved to provide this wood, then an amendment should be made to the bill to vote that money be deducted from the compensation of the members of the House on a day's pay. That if the congressmen want to engage in this charity, it should come out of their own paychecks. Here are the lessons that we need to learn from today's history lesson. Things that we need to share with our government because they have forgotten. The money collected from the people, number one, is not revenue, but public property. The government does not own anything unless they first take it from the people. Even the furniture in the White House, even the popcorn that the Obama family eats when they're watching TV does not come from the government, but comes from the people. The government has no revenue. It does nothing to earn its own money. It has to take it from the people first, which means that popcorn that the Obama family is eating as they're watching TV is in actuality public property. And even if they wanted to stand on the street corner and hand out that popcorn, it is not theirs to give. Lesson number one, the money collected is from the people. It is not the revenue of the government, but public property. Lesson number two, in spending public property, Congress is limited by the proper confines of the Constitution, not ones established through forced construction. Congress cannot invent reasons and justifications to spend money by expanding principles in the Constitution that simply do not exist. Madison said the General Welfare Clause is not a list of powers, but a constraint of them. Lesson number one, money collected is from the people. It is not revenue of the government, but public property. Lesson number two, in spending that public property, Congress can only engage in, as Madison says, in the spending of war, peace, negotiations, and foreign commerce. Congress can only spend on foreign affairs. Lesson number three, personal moral integrity could inhibit Congress from violating points 1 and 2. If we actually had a morally minded Congress who understood and wanted to act appropriately, that the money that they have is ours and not theirs, we wouldn't have to teach them 1 and 2 because they would have a moral foundation, personal integrity that would say, wait a minute, as James Blair said, as James Polk said, it's not ours to spend. And if we are so moved by this charity, then guess what? We must have a moral government that is willing to give from their own paychecks. Thomas Paine said, what once was called plunder is now called revenue. Frederick Bastiat said, but how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, the taking from another